Kansas Prairie, 1847. The frontier sprawls vast and untamed, a land of endless grass, searing sun, and whispers of danger. Dust swirls on the horizon, the promise of a new life in the west beckons, but survival demands grit, heart, and a touch of luck. The Kansas dawn broke slow, painting the prairie in hues of gold and crimson, the air sharp with the bite of early frost. Jonathan Jack Callahan, a weathered homesteader of 32, stepped onto the porch of his log cabin, his boots scuffing the worn planks. 8 years ago, he'd staked this claim after cholera stole his family in Missouri, leaving him to wrestle a living from the stubborn soil. His homestead was modest but proud. A sturdy cabin, a barn sheltering his chestnut horse, rusty 4 cows, a dozen chickens, and a scrappy mutt named Scout who trailed him like a faithful shadow. The wind carried the scent of dry grass mingled with the faint tang of wood smoke from last night's fire. Jack was headed to the barn, a bucket of feed slung over his shoulder, when he caught movement behind the gnarled apple tree near the corral. The tree, battered by an early freeze, had dropped its fruit weeks ago, and Jack hadn't bothered to clear the rotting pile. Now 4 figures crouched in the dirt, their shapes small and furtive. He set the bucket down, his hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip, and approached with the caution of a man who'd learned the frontier's hard lessons. In the pale morning light, he saw a woman, her calico dresses faded and patched, scraping mold off a rotten apple with a dull knife. Beside her, 3 girls aged about 10, 7, and 4 worked with quiet desperation, peeling spoiled bits and eating what remained. Their thin faces were smudged with dirt, their clothes threadbare, patched until little of the original fabric remained. The oldest girl glanced up, her hazel eyes sharp and wary, while the youngest clutched a tattered rag doll, her gaze fixed on the fruit. Jack's heart clenched. He'd seen hardship aplenty, starving travelers, broken wagons, graves dotting the trail. But this sight cut deeper than most. "Morning, folks," he said, keeping his voice low and easy hands raised to show he meant no harm. "No call to eat that muck. I got better fare inside." The woman scrambled to her feet, pulling the girls behind her. Her hazel eyes flashed with fear and defiance, her matted hair falling loose around a face etched with hunger and sleepless nights. She couldn't be much past 25, but life had carved lines into her features. "We ain't stealing, mister," she said, her voice hoarse. "These apples were on the ground and we figured," "Easy, ma'am," Jack cut in, his tone gentle but firm. "Ain't nobody accusing you of nothing. Just saying you look like you could use a hot meal and a roof over your heads." She studied him, her grip on the girls tightening. The wind tugged at her hair, and Jack noticed the hollows in her cheeks, the way her dress hung loose on her frame. The girls shivered, their thin shawls no match for the morning chill. "Name's Jack Callahan," he offered, tipping his weathered hat. "This here's my spread. You got a name, ma'am?" She hesitated, then straightened as if summoning her last reserves of pride. "Abigail Johnson. These are my girls, Annabeth and Clara." Jack nodded, taking in the girls. Anna, the oldest at 10, had her mother's hazel eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw, like she'd seen too much for her years. Beth, about 7, looked ready to bolt, her fingers twitching nervously. Clara, just 4, clung to Abigail's skirt, her blue eyes wide and trusting, despite their plight. "Where you headed?" Jack asked, keeping his distance to avoid spooking them. "West," Abigail said, her voice barely above a whisper. "California, if we can make it." Jack's brow furrowed. He'd heard the tales gold in the Sierras, land free for the taking. He'd also heard the darker stories of wagon trains lost to disease, starvation, or worse. "Got kin out there?" Abigail's gaze faltered, pain flickering in her eyes. "Had a husband. Henry. He went ahead 2 years back, said he'd send for us once he struck it rich." Her voice trailed off, and Jack read the rest in her silence. No word, no money, just a woman and 3 kids left to fend for themselves. The wind gusted, sending a chill through the air. Clara shivered, her small frame trembling, her rag doll clutched tight. Jack made his decision. He unbuttoned his heavy wool coat, the one his ma had sewn before she passed, and held it out. "Come on in, ma'am. No sense freezing when there's a fire and food inside." Abigail stepped back, her eyes narrowing. "We don't take charity, mister." "We'll move on, ma'am," Jack said, his voice steady. "When's the last time these young'uns had a proper meal?" The question hung like smoke. Abigail looked down at her girls, her shoulders sagging. Anna spoke up, her voice small but honest. "Mama, I'm powerful hungry." Abigail's resolve crumbled. "We got no money to pay you," she said, the words tumbling out. "But I can work. I cook, clean, mend. I'm handy with livestock, too. Jack nodded as if considering a business deal. Well, now I could use some help around here. Place gets mighty lonesome, and there's more work than daylight. Let's start with breakfast, and we'll figure the rest later. This time, Abigail took the coat, wrapping it around her shoulders. It was too big, but Jack saw the tension ease from her frame. Thank you, she whispered. Jack picked up his bucket and gestured toward the cabin. Come on, then. Let's get you warmed up. As they crossed the yard, Clara slipped her tiny hand into Jack's. Her fingers were cold as winter stones, but they curled around his with trust that made his throat tighten. Mr. Jack, she said, her voice barely audible. You got any apples that ain't bad? Jack chuckled softly. Sure do, little miss. Got some in the root cellar, sweet as honey. You'll see. The cabin was small, but solid, built from logs Jack had hewed himself during his first brutal winter on the prairie. Inside, a stone fireplace warmed the main room, which served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with jars of preserves, sacks of flour, dried herbs, and a few dog-eared books, remnants of his ma's love for learning. A rough-hewn table stood at the center, flanked by 4 chairs he'd carved during long, lonely nights. Sit yourselves down, Jack said, setting his bucket by the door. I'll get the fire going proper and rustle up some grub. Abigail hesitated, still clutching his coat. You sure about this, Mr. Callahan? We're strangers to you. Jack struck a match, coaxing the kindling to life. I know you're tired and hungry, ma'am. I know you love your girls enough to swallow your pride and take help when they need it. That's all I'd need to know. The fire caught, casting a warm glow across the room. Jack moved to the pantry, pulling out a loaf of bread he'd baked 2 days prior, a slab of smoked bacon, and a jar of apple butter. He sliced thick pieces of bread, fried the bacon in a cast-iron skillet until it sizzled, and set a kettle of coffee to boil. For the girls, he brought up a basket of good apples from the cellar, their skins red and glossy, free of blemish. Here now, Jack said, setting the food on the table. This'll tide you over while I fix something heartier. Abigail tried to help, but Jack waved her off. You look ready to drop, ma'am. Rest a spell. As he worked at the stove, stirring a pot of cornmeal mush laced with molasses, Jack listened to the quiet sounds behind him. The girls eating with careful restraint, Abigail's soft reminders about manners, the crackle of the fire. Anna took small bites, her eyes darting to her sister's plates, ensuring they had enough. Beth nibbled her apple, her gaze wandering around the room, taking in the shelves, the rifle rack, the patch quilt draped over a chair. Clara held her apple in both hands, savoring each bite like it was a treasure her ragdoll propped beside her. Where you folks from, originally? Jack asked over his shoulder, stirring the mush. Ohio. Abigail replied, her voice softening. Had a farm near Cincinnati. Nothing grand, but it was ours. What happened? A long pause. Jack didn't push, just kept stirring, the spoon scraping the pot. Finally, Abigail spoke, her words heavy. Bank took it. Bad harvest 3 years running, and we couldn't pay. Henry said we'd do better out west. Said there was gold just waiting to be picked up, enough to set us up for life. Jack nodded grimly. He'd heard that story too many times, the promise of riches luring folks from their homes only to leave them broken on the trail. How long you been walking? Weeks. Beth piped up, her mouth full of bread. Had a wagon for a spell, but the axle broke. Had to leave it behind. Sold the oxen in Junction City, Abigail added. Got enough for supplies, but not for another wagon. Been on foot since. Jack ladled the mush into bowls and set them on the table, the sweet aroma filling the room. Clara's eyes widened and she clapped her hands. Smells like Christmas, she said, earning a faint smile from her mother. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons and the occasional sigh of contentment. Jack watched the girls, noting how Anna kept a protective eye on her sisters, how Beth tried to eat slowly despite her hunger, how Clara's small frame seemed to grow stronger with each bite. Abigail ate sparingly, ensuring the girls had their fill, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting trouble. When the meal was done, Abigail rose to clear the dishes, but Jack stopped her. Dishes will keep till morning. Looks like Clara's about to nod off. Indeed, the youngest was struggling to keep her eyes open, her head drooping. Anna wasn't faring much better, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Even Beth, usually full of energy, yawned widely. There's a spare room off the kitchen, Jack said. Got a good bed and warm quilts. You're welcome to it. Abigail's eyes glistened, a mix of gratitude and wariness. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack looked out the window at the darkening prairie, the stars just beginning to pierce the sky. Why was he doing this? Maybe it was the memory of his ma who'd fed every weary traveler who knocked on her door. Maybe it was the loneliness that had settled in his bones, a weight he'd carried since his family's graves were dug. Or maybe it was just the right thing to do. My ma used to say kindness is like planting seeds, he said finally. You sow it, and maybe it grows into something good. Abigail nodded, accepting the answer. Come on, girls, she said softly. Time for bed. As Jack banked the fire, he heard quiet voices from the spare room. Abigail's gentle murmurs, Anna's whispered questions about tomorrow, Clara's sleepy replies about her doll Daisy. The sounds of a family, something Jack hadn't heard in years. He stood at his own window, staring at the moonlit prairie, and felt a spark of something he thought he'd lost hope. The next morning, Jack woke to the smell of coffee and sizzling bacon, a rarity in his bachelor household. He dressed quickly, pulling on his worn flannel shirt and boots, and found Abigail at the stove, flipping flapjacks with practiced ease. Anna was setting the table, carefully arranging tin plates and forks. Beth played with Scout in the corner, giggling as the dog nipped at her fingers, his tail wagging furiously. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, brushing her ragdoll's yarn hair with a small stick, humming a tuneless melody. Morning, ma'am, Jack said, accepting a cup of coffee from Abigail. It was richer than his usual brew. With a hint of sweetness he couldn't place, maybe a touch of molasses. Morning, she replied, sliding a plate of flapjacks in front of him. Hope you don't mind. I took over your kitchen. Not a bit, Jack said, taking a bite. The flapjacks were light and fluffy, drizzled with molasses, warm and comforting. These are mighty fine. Abigail smiled, a rare sight that lit up her tired face. Learned from my ma. She could make a feast out of nothing but grit and gumption. Over breakfast, they fell into an easy rhythm, as if they'd been sharing meals for years. Anna cleared the dishes without being asked, stacking them neatly by the wash basin. Beth showed Jack her doll named Daisy, after a cow they'd once owned on their Ohio farm. She was the best milker we had, Beth said proudly. Gave a whole bucket every morning. Clara shyly offered Jack a bite of her flapjack, holding it out with both hands. Jack accepted with a grin, pretending to take a huge chomp, which made her giggle. You're a fine cook, Miss Clara, he said, winking. After breakfast, Jack showed them the homestead, eager to share the world he'd built. The barn housed Rusty, who snorted a greeting, 4 cows lowing softly, and a dozen chickens, including a feisty hen named Speckles, who pecked at Beth's boots. The garden plot, though wilted from the frost, still yielded carrots, potatoes, and a few late onions. Beyond lay fields of wheat, their golden stalks swaying ready for harvest, if Jack could find the time. This is beautiful, Abigail said, standing at the edge of the wheat field, the morning sun turning the stalks to burnished gold. You've built something real here, Mr. Callahan. Took time, Jack said, a note of pride in his voice. When I claimed this land wasn't nothing but grass and hope. Dug the well by hand, cut every log for the cabin. Took a year just to get the first crop in. Beth chased a grasshopper through the wheat, her laughter carrying on the breeze like a bell. Clara sat in the grass weaving a chain of prairie flowers, yellow asters and purple clover, her small fingers deft. Anna stayed close to her mother, her eyes scanning the horizon, always watchful. What made you pick this spot? Abigail asked, shielding her eyes against the sun. Jack pointed to a low rise north of the cabin, its crest dotted with scrub oak. High ground. Good water from the creek yonder, and that hill breaks the winter wind. Plus you can see for miles. A man likes to know what's coming. As if on cue, a dust cloud appeared to the east, faint but growing. Jack shaded his eyes, his hand drifting to his revolver. Somebody's coming, he said quietly, his voice steady but alert. Abigail tensed her hand, reaching for Beth, who'd stopped her chase, and looked toward the dust with unease. Clara froze, clutching her flower chain. The rider resolved into a man on a gray mare, his silver beard glinting in the sun. Jack relaxed as he recognized Doc Thompson, the local sawbones and newsbearer, a man known for his sharp tongue and sharper remedies. Jack Doc called, reining in his horse, whose flanks were lathered from a hard ride. Glad I caught you home, Doc Jack replied, stepping forward. What brings you out this early? Doc's eyes flicked to Abigail and the girls, curiosity plain, but his tone was grim. Trouble brewing. Indians hit farms south of here, burned out the Carters 3 days back, took their stock. Jack's blood chilled. The Carters were good folks with kids not much older than Anna. He'd shared a whiskey with Tom Carter at the Junction City Saloon last spring. They make it out. Barely, Doc said, spitting into the dirt. Lost everything but their lives. Found 'em half dead on the trail to town. Folks in Junction City are fording up till the trouble passes. How many farms hit, Jack asked, his mind already turning to his own defenses. 4, far as we know, Doc replied, adjusting his hat. Might be more. No pattern to it, just hitting and running. Best head to town, Jack, especially with guests to think about. Abigail stepped forward, her chin high despite the fear in her eyes. We don't want to be a burden. If staying puts Mr. Callahan in danger, we'll move on. Nobody's going nowhere yet, Jack said firmly, his voice cutting through her protest. He turned to Doc. How recent were these attacks? Yesterday morning was the last, Doc said. Could be they've moved on, or could be they're just starting. Army's sending a patrol, but they're spread thin. Doc tipped his hat to Abigail, his eyes softening at the sight of the girls. You folks stay sharp. I'll spread the word to the next homestead. He spurred his mare and rode off, leaving a trail of dust. Jack faced 3 pairs of worried eyes. Clara tugged at his sleeve, her voice small. Are the bad men gonna hurt us? Said Mr. Jack. Jack knelt to her level, forcing a smile. Not if I can help it, little miss. But we gotta be smart and ready. He stood, his mind racing. Junction City was 20 miles away, a hard day's ride longer, with 3 young girls on foot. The open road was a gamble, with raiders about, and the town's fortifications were little more than a stockade around the saloon and general store. His cabin was defensible with clear sight lines, sturdy log walls, and a root cellar for emergencies. He'd faced trouble before, coyotes, rustlers, a Comanche scout, years back, and come out fine. We could go to town. Abigail offered, her voice uncertain, her hands clasped tightly. Jack shook his head. Road's too exposed, and we don't know where those raiders are. We're safer here, but we'll be ready for anything. The rest of the day was spent in preparation, the air went heavy with purpose. Jack checked his arsenal, 2 rifles, a double-barreled shotgun, and his Colt revolver, cleaning and loading each with care. He showed Abigail how to handle the shotgun, guiding her hands to the stock, his touch steady but respectful. Ever fired a gun, he asked. Some, she said, her grip firm but unpracticed. Henry taught me to shoot rabbits back in Ohio. Nothing like this. It's forgiving, Jack said, adjusting her stance. Point and pull. Don't worry about aiming, just keep your eyes on the target. Anna proved a quick study, her small hands steady as she helped carry ammunition and water to the cabin. She listened intently as Jack explained how to load the rifle, her brow furrowed with concentration. Beth kept Clara busy with games, weaving more flower chains, though her eyes darted to the windows every few minutes. Jack brought the livestock closer to the barn, securing Rusty and the cows against theft, and locked the chicken coop tight, Speckles clucking in protest. As evening fell, Jack made final rounds, checking the well, the root cellar, and the barn's hidden tunnel, a precaution he'd dug years ago during Comanche raids. Abigail joined him on the porch, the sun sinking in a blaze of orange and purple, the prairie stretching endless and quiet. You think they'll come here? She asked, her voice low, her hands twisting the edge of his borrowed coat. Hard to say, Jack admitted, leaning against the porch rail. Might pass us by. Might not. If they do, we'll give them a fight they won't forget. Abigail nodded, her eyes on the horizon. I'm scared, Jack, she admitted, the words spilling out. Not just for me, but for the girls. They've been through so much already. Jack turned to her, his voice soft but firm. I ain't gonna let anything happen to you or them young'uns. You got my word. She met his gaze, searching his face, then nodded. I believe you. Supper was quiet, the air thick with tension. Abigail's venison stew, rich with potatoes and carrots from the garden, was hearty, but even Clara ate sparingly, her eyes wide with unspoken fear. Beth pushed her food around her plate while Anna ate mechanically, her gaze fixed on the shuttered window. After dishes, Jack banked the fire low and drew the curtains tight, the cabin feeling smaller, more like a fortress. Girls sleep with us tonight, Abigail said, her tone leaving no room for argument. All together in the spare room. Jack nodded. I'll take the front room, keep watch. You holler if you need me. He settled by the window, rifle across his knees, the night stretching cold and clear. Hours passed, marked by the hoot of an owl, the distant yip of a coyote, and Rusty's restless snorts from the corral. Jack dozed fitfully, his senses honed by years on the frontier, every creak of the cabin making his hand tighten on the rifle. Near dawn, a muffled whinny, not Rusty's, jerked him awake. He peered through a gap in the curtain, his heart pounding. Shadows moved in the gray light, 6 or 7 figures creeping toward the cabin. Painted faces, feathers, the glint of knives and bows. Not traitors, warriors. Jack moved silently to the bedroom. Abigail, he whispered, shaking her shoulder. Wake up, we got company. She was alert instantly, her eyes wide as she shook the girls awake. How many, she hissed, her voice barely audible. Half a dozen, maybe more, Jack said, keeping his tone calm. Get to the root cellar. You know the way. Abigail nodded, herding Annabeth and Clara to the kitchen. The trap door, hidden under a rug, creaked softly as they descended into the dark, damp space. Anna clutched the rifle Jack had given her, her hands trembling but resolute. Beth held Clara close, whispering words of comfort. Jack waited until the trapdoor closed, then returned to the window, his pulse steady despite the danger. The first arrow thudded into the shutter, splintering wood, the sound sharp in the pre-dawn silence. Jack pushed his rifle barrel through a gap and fired, the crack echoing across the prairie. A warrior dropped in the dirt, clutching his chest, but the others scattered their movements, swift and practiced. Jack counted 7 armed with bows, knives, and a few rifles, their faces painted with streaks of red and black. I see you, white man, a voice called from the barn, the English thick with accent but clear. Come out and maybe we spare the women. Jack didn't answer, moving to another window, his boots silent on the floorboards. A flaming arrow arced through the air, striking the roof with a soft thud. He cursed under his breath. Fire was his worst fear. The cabin was solid but dry as tinder after weeks without rain. Another arrow hit the sidewall, and smoke began to curl acrid and thick. He spotted a warrior behind the woodpile, knocking a fire arrow. Jack aimed and fired, the man collapsing with a grunt. But the distraction cost him. The front door shuddered under a heavy blow, a tomahawk maybe, or a shoulder. The oak bar held, but it wouldn't for long. Jack grabbed the shotgun, positioning himself by the door, his back to the wall. When it burst inward, 2 warriors charged, their knives gleaming. He fired both barrels, the blast deafening the air, filling with the smell of gunpowder. Both fell, but more were coming, their shouts rising over the crackle of flames. Jack worked the rifle's lever, firing at shadows in the doorway. An arrow grazed his shoulder, tearing through his shirt, blood soaking the fabric. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the pain, but his ammunition was dwindling, only a handful of rounds left. Time to go. Jack grabbed his rifle and a pouch of bullets, then darted to the kitchen. He lifted the trap door and dropped into the cellar, pulling it shut behind him. The air was cool and earthy, lined with shelves of preserves, sacks of potatoes, and barrels of water. In the corner, Abigail and the girls huddled, their faces pale in the dim light, filtering through cracks above. You hurt, Abigail whispered, eyeing his bloodied shoulder, her voice tight with worry. Just a scratch, Jack lied, wincing as he shifted. Above, boots stomped through the cabin, voices, barking in an unfamiliar tongue, angry, methodical, searching. Someone kicked over a chair, the crash making Clara whimper. Beth held her sister close, her voice a fierce whisper. Hush, Clara. We gotta be quiet. Anna gripped the rifle, her knuckles white. Can I help, Mr. Jack? She asked, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. You're helping by staying safe, Jack said, his tone firm, but kind. Keep that rifle ready, but don't shoot unless I say. The search dragged on, the smell of smoke growing stronger, seeping through the floorboards. Clara pressed against Jack, her voice a whisper. Will they find us? Not if we're quiet, he murmured, his hand resting on her head. Finally, the voices faded, the stomping boots retreating. Jack eased the trap door open a crack, peering into the kitchen. The room was filling with smoke flames, licking the front wall, the air hot and choking. They've fired the house, he said grimly. We gotta move. Abigail's face blanched, her eyes wide with horror. The house can be rebuilt. Jack cut in, his voice sharp to snap her out of it. Let's stay alive first. He led them to the cellar's back wall, where a low tunnel stretched toward the barn, a precaution he'd dug years ago during Comanche raids, when rustlers were a constant threat. The passage was tight, the dirt walls crumbling under their hands, the air damp and heavy. Jack crawled, first rifle clutched awkwardly, his shoulder screaming with each movement. Abigail followed, urging the girls along. Clara whimpered, her small frame shaking, but Beth hushed her, her voice steady despite her own fear. Keep going, Clara, Beth whispered. We're almost there. The tunnel ended at a wooden ladder topped by a trap door hidden behind hay bales in the barn. Jack listened for movement above, then pushed it open, wincing as his shoulder protested. The barn was quiet, save for Rusty's nervous snorts and the clucking of Speckles in her coop. He helped the others up, closing the trap door and covering it with hay. "Stay low," he whispered, peering through a gap in the barn wall. The cabin was ablaze, flames leaping into the dawn sky, the roof collapsing with a groan. The warriors hadn't left. They lounged around the fire, eating Jack's stores, their horses tethered near the corral. Two stood guard, their eyes scanning the yard. "They know we got out," Jack said, his voice low. "They're waiting for us to show ourselves." Abigail joined him, her face set with determination. "What now?" "We wait," Jack said. "Let them think we burned. Maybe they'll move on." They hid behind grain bins, the hours crawling by in tense silence. The warriors called to each other, their voices fading as the sun climbed their horses, stamping impatiently. Once a warrior entered the barn, his boots scuffing the dirt as he poked through the hay with a spear. Jack held his breath, hand on his Colt, ready to fire if needed. Clara buried her face in Abigail's skirt, muffling a sob. The warrior lingered, then left, cursing in his tongue. By noon, the raiders were gone, their hoofprints trailing east, leaving only ashes and trampled earth. Jack waited another hour before checking his rifle ready. "Think they're clear," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke and strain. "We'll move at dusk." Abigail stared at the ruins of the cabin, guilt etching her features. "This is our fault," she said, her voice breaking. "If we hadn't come stop that," Jack said firmly, his hand on her shoulder. "Raiders been hitting farms all over. Ain't on you." Clara tugged at his sleeve, her blue eyes wide with tears. "I'm sorry." "They burned your house, Mr. Jack." Jack knelt, squeezing her hand gently. "Houses can be rebuilt. Little miss, you're safe, and that's what counts." As dusk fell, painting the prairie in shades of violet, Jack saddled Rusty and loaded what he could, salvage a few blankets, a sack of jerky, a tin of matches, his hidden coin pouch. Abigail and the girls mounted Rusty, Clara in her mother's lap, Anna and Beth clinging behind, their faces pale but resolute. Jack led on foot, Scout trotting at his side, his ears pricked for danger. They headed for Joe Henderson's place 5 miles north, praying the raiders hadn't struck there too. The prairie was silent, save for the rustle of grass and the distant howl of a coyote. Jack kept a wary eye on the horizon, his shoulder throbbing with each step, the makeshift bandage Abigail had tied already soaked with blood. No one spoke the weight of their loss, heavy the crackle of the distant fire still echoing in their ears. Dawn broke as they neared Joe's homestead, a sturdy spread with a log house and a sprawling corral. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Jack's tension eased. Joe met them at the door, his rifle in hand, his weathered face breaking into relief. "Jack, thank God," he said, lowering the weapon. "Saw the smoke yesterday, feared the worst." "Raiders hit at dawn," Jack said, helping Abigail and the girls down from Rusty. "Burned us out. Got away through the cellar tunnel." Joe's wife Martha appeared, her kind eyes taking in their bedraggled state. Jack's bloodied shoulder, the girls' smudged faces, Abigail's haunted expression. "Get inside," she said, her voice warm but firm. "You're bleeding, Jack." "Let me tend that." Martha cleaned Jack's wound, an arrow gash deeper than he'd let on the flesh, raw and angry. She stitched it with practiced hands, ignoring his protests, while Abigail and the girls ate hot porridge at the kitchen table. The warmth of the Henderson home, a stark contrast to the ashes they'd left behind. Joe filled them in 6 farms hit in the past week. The Carters and others burned out an army patrol too late to help. "You're welcome here long as you need," Martha said, bustling about with a kettle of tea. "Got room, and Joe could use help with the harvest." Jack looked at Abigail, who held Clara close, Anna and Beth at her side, their spoons scraping the bowls. "That's kind," Martha Abigail said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "But we can't stay forever." "Don't start with that," Jack said, gently wincing as Martha tied off the bandage. "What happened ain't your fault." Joe clapped Jack on his good shoulder. "Your family now, Callahan. You and these ladies. We look out for our own." Over the next weeks, they settled into life at Joe's. Jack threw himself into the harvest, swinging a scythe alongside Joe, the labor easing his restless thoughts. The wheat fields stretched golden under the autumn sun, and the work was grueling but honest, each swing of the blade a step toward healing. Abigail helped Martha with chores, mending clothes, churning butter, baking cornbread that filled the house with warmth. Anna and Beth joined the Henderson kids, 2 boys and a girl, in play, their laughter echoing as they chased each other through the yard, Scout bounding after them. Clara stayed close to Abigail, her shyness fading as she took to helping Martha feed the chickens, giggling when Speckles' cousin, a hen named Dottie, pecked at her toes. One evening as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of fire, Jack and Abigail sat on Joe's porch, the girls playing nearby with a homemade kite fashioned from sticks in an old flour sack. The air was cool, the scent of harvested wheat mingling with wood smoke. Abigail broke the silence, her voice low. "I've been thinking about California, about Henry." Jack's heart sank, but he nodded, keeping his tone even. "You still aiming to find him?" Abigail stared at the prairie, her hands folded in her lap. "I don't know. Part of me says I should. He's their pa. But another part," she trailed off, her eyes distant. 2 years, Jack. No letter, no word. A man who loved us wouldn't leave us to starve. Jack understood. The hopeful woman who'd left Ohio was gone, replaced by one who'd learned to stand alone, to protect her girls through sheer will. "What's your heart say?" he asked, his voice soft. "Oh, that Henry made his choice," she said, her voice steady now. "Whether he's dead or just didn't want us, it's time to let go. The girls deserve a home, not a ghost." Jack took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He'd come to care for Abigail and the girls, their presence filling the empty spaces in his life. "Abigail," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I ain't got much, just a burned-out farm and a will to work. But I care for you and the girls more than I have thought I could again. Would you consider taking a chance on me? We could head to Oregon, start fresh, build a new life together." Abigail's eyes softened, a smile breaking through her weariness. She reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. "Jack Callahan, are you proposing? I reckon I am," he said, a grin spreading across his face. She leaned in, kissing him softly, her lips tasting of salt and hope. "Yes," she whispered, "I'll marry you." From the yard, the girls' laughter mingled with the Henderson kids, the kite soaring high above the prairie. Jack squeezed Abigail's hand, a future taking shape, a new home, a family, a life worth fighting for. They wed 2 weeks later in Joe's yard, a simple ceremony under a spreading oak. Joe officiated, his voice steady, as he read from a worn Bible, while Martha served a feast of roast venison, cornbread, and apple pie made from Jack's salvaged cellar stock. Anna stood as bridesmaid, her face solemn but proud, while Beth and Clara scattered wildflowers, asters, and clover over the grass. Jack slipped his ma's gold ring on Abigail's finger, the metal warm from his pocket, and felt his heart swell as she smiled up at him. That winter, they stayed in Junction City, a rough-and-tumble outpost of saloons and trading posts. Jack worked at the blacksmith's forge, shoeing horses and mending wagon wheels, his hands steady despite the ache in his shoulder. Abigail sewed for townsfolk, her needle flying through calico and denim, earning enough to buy supplies for the journey west. The girls thrived, their faces rounding with regular meals, their laughter a constant in the Henderson home. Anna helped at the general store, counting pennies with care. Beth explored the town, her curiosity leading her to the livery stable where she petted the horses and earned a scolding from the stable master. Clara sang to Scout, her voice sweet and clear, drawing smiles from passers-by. Come spring, they joined a wagon train bound for Oregon, their worldly goods packed in a sturdy wagon pulled by oxen named Buck and Daisy, traded for Jack's last cow. The Oregon Trail was brutal, a ribbon of dust and danger stretching across the continent. The sun blazed mercilessly, dust choking their lungs, coating their clothes in a gritty film. They forded rivers, the Platte shallow but treacherous with hidden currents. The Snake River was worse, its waters swift and deep, nearly claiming their wagon when a wheel caught on a rock. Hold tight, Jack shouted as they crossed water, swirling around the wagon, Buck and Daisy straining against the current. Clara clung to Abigail, her face buried in her mother's skirt, while Beth gripped Anna's hand, her eyes wide with fear. Scout swam alongside his barks, lost in the roar of the river. Abigail stood on the wagon's bench, her voice calm but firm. Keep steady, girls, we're almost there. Jack waded into the water, his boots slipping on the slick rocks, and pushed the wagon free, his shoulders screaming with the effort. They reached the other side, soaked but unharmed, collapsing on the bank in a heap of relief. We did it, Anna said, her voice trembling with pride. You're tougher than nails, Jack said, ruffling her hair, his grin masking his exhaustion. The Blue Mountains tested them next, the trail steep and rocky, the air thin and cold. They pushed the wagon up narrow passes, muscles straining, Buck and Daisy heaving with effort. At one point, a wheel cracked, forcing them to stop for repairs. Jack worked with another pioneer, a grizzled trapper named Amos, to carve a new spoke from a fallen pine, their hands blistered but steady. Rough road, Amos said, spitting tobacco into the dirt. But you got a good family there, Callahan. They'll see you through. Jack glanced at Abigail, who was soothing Clara with a lullaby, and Anna, who was helping Beth gather firewood. Reckon you're right, he said. At the summit, the Willamette Valley spread below a patchwork of green fields and sparkling creeks, a promise of home. We're almost there, Abigail set her hand in Jack's, her voice thick with emotion. Campfires brought tales from fellow travelers, some of hope, others of loss. A family from Illinois shared their fire one night, warning of cholera ahead on the trail. Lost my brother last week, the mother said, her eyes hollow. Boil your water and don't trust the streams. Jack doubled their water rations, boiling every drop, praying they'd skirt the disease. He watched Abigail and the girls closely checking for fever, his heart easing each day they stayed healthy. One evening, as they camped near the Columbia River, Beth found a wounded sparrow, its wing broken. She cradled it, gently, tears in her eyes. Can we save it? Said Jack. Jack fashioned a tiny splint from a twig, his hands careful. We'll try, Beth. Sometimes all you can do is give something a chance. The sparrow died that night, and Beth buried it under a willow, marking the spot with a stone. Abigail held her close, whispering words of comfort, while Jack looked on, his heart heavy. The trail took as much as it gave, but they pressed on. In the Willamette Valley, they claimed a parcel of land by a clear creek, the soil rich and dark, the air sweet with pine and clover. Jack built a new cabin, stronger than the last, its logs hewn from towering firs, its chimney crafted from river stones. Abigail planted a garden, setting their Kansas apple sapling in a sunny spot, its roots taking hold in the fertile earth. Anna helped with chores, her hands steady, as she milked the new cow Mabel traded for at the valley's trading post. Beth explored the woods, her curiosity leading her to streams teeming with trout. Clara sang to scout, her voice sweet as a lark, weaving melodies that drifted over the valley. Years passed, their farm flourishing under their care. Anna became a teacher. Her schoolhouse, a hub for the growing community, her lessons filled with the stories of their journey. Beth wed a carpenter, their home, a sturdy cabin nearby, their children playing with Jack and Abigail's grandkids. Clara's piano playing, learned on a second-hand instrument bartered from a trader, drew crowds at community gatherings, her melodies weaving the valley's story of hope and resilience. One autumn evening, Jack and Abigail sat on their porch, the air cool and crisp, the apple tree heavy with fruit, sweet crisp, a taste of their past. Their grandchildren played in the yard, chasing fireflies, their laughter echoing. Scout, gray muzzled now, lay at their feet, his tail thumping softly. Never thought we'd have this, Jack set his arm around Abigail.